We are now moving into the sector analysis of the Maine's vacation and hospitality forecast. Steve Hewins of the Maine Innkeepers Association will be giving us that.
Thank you very much. I actually represent two associations, by the way, Maine Innkeepers Association and the Maine Restaurant Association. I'm the president of both, two separate organizations right now that are merging themselves into one over the course of this year. Let me get my clicker. So I'm going to be reporting on a fairly strong hospitality industry in the state today. As with everything in Maine, there's always storm clouds brewing, and I'll touch a little bit on that as well. And I put this presentation together. I want to recognize Nick Farrell from Dayglow Commercial Group also put this together with me and came up with a lot of the data on transactions that we'll show shortly in the end. So let's start with some national lodging statistics to give you a sense of where the industry is at. As you can see right now, we're blown past the pre-recession occupancy levels in the United States back in '08. But you'll notice it's flattened out in terms of occupancy. That's a sign of, that the experts can look at. I look at that tending to be that the market is fairly saturated with hotels right now. But there's a positive story behind that, and it's this one. As you can see here, the average daily rate continues to be on the rise. In the case of ADR, from 2008 to now, it's really up about, well, you won't see the small numbers, but you do have it in your package and on your thumbstick there. The rate's really gone from $108 a night back in '08 and up to $130 a night now in 2018 projected. Similarly, RevPAR is up as well, because RevPAR is a metric that we look at very closely in the industry because it's really a recognition of revenue received. So it's the money. And here it's tracking pretty close to the ADR as well, on the rise and well past pre-recession levels in the United States. Talk a bit about Maine and compare Maine with the national numbers. So again, on this slide, what you can see here is the larger bar is the national number and the lower bar is Maine. We're seeing a fairly steady rise since the pre-recession levels, but as you note, we have not passed the pre-recession occupancy levels in the state, which is surprising given the fact that we've seen a lot of growth in the industry as well. But similar to the other national slide, the RevPAR, I'm looking at the ADR now. The ADR is up significantly. And we're projecting that we're going to see equal to the national average in 2018. So a positive sign, indication of Maine's desirability as a destination. So the RevPAR, as I said earlier, also moving up fast, again, far higher than pre-recession levels, and another positive sign for the sector in the state. This is not totally easy to see, as I can tell right now. We're looking at Old Orchard Beach, for those that are interested. Next slide? No. Well, Old Orchard Beach represents summer in Maine, I'll give it that. I will say that what you can't see pretty much there is data relative to visitation. Now, visitation is based on survey data done by a consulting firm engaged by the state called EPA. So they interview people, and from that they gauge a lot of data with which the state uses to develop its tourism strategies. The numbers show that you can't see, but are very strong. And what you can't really tell at the bottom, and again, it's in your information, is it breaks out the sectors of the state. Now, the state positions different regions under different names they've created. The biggest bar on the left is the Maine beaches, which is basically South Coast. And you can see it always leads in the numbers. And down east in Acadia is the next line, Maine Lakes and Mountains, Maine Highlands, Mid-Coast, and then the next thing down is Portland. Now, many of you might suspect that Portland would be at the top, given the predominance of hotels and that sort of thing here, but surprisingly, it continues to exist in that sector. I think the beach coast area in the South Coast is drawing a lot of people from New Hampshire and Massachusetts now, similar to how Cape Cod, where I grew up many years ago, used to draw from Boston. I think we've become the new Cape Cod in the south coast of Maine. As far as winter's concerned, again, winter numbers obviously are quite a bit less. I'm going to talk about seasonality in just a second and what the factor that is in terms of our occupancy rates. Because one of the reasons our occupancy rates are low is because of that seasonality. We don't see in January, even in Portland, the same occupancy that we see in the summer when we have $400 room nights and we're full. Here, this time of year, on a night like tonight, the occupancy rates are obviously much less when you average that out. It takes our overall annual occupancy numbers down. But again, here you can see the same basic graphs. The only thing you'll see now differently here is the Maine Highlands and the Maine lakes and mountains appears higher as a percentage of the overall amount, which shows evidence of obviously the ski and the snowmobile industry, that predominance in the winter. This is a bit of a snapshot of the hospitality industry first at a glance. So we have 1,340 lodging properties in the state of Maine. We have 38,000 guest rooms. These are licensed properties. I say that for a specific reason that I will get to shortly. But in terms of licensed properties, you can also see that we have a large percentage of those, more than a third, are under 75 room units. And many of them are bed and breakfasts that are up to 3 to 6 rooms. Restaurants are similarly very diverse. People think of the Maine Restaurant Association as, fine dining and this and that, but we're every restaurant in the state of Maine, from McDonald's right on through to 555 and 4th Street and places like that, and everywhere in between, all across the state. Almost 5,000 restaurant establishments representing 335,000 seats. Hotel bedrooms are about 1/10 of that. So 10 restaurants for every 1 hotel room in the state of Maine. So this, again, a small slide, but there's very important data here. This is the data that I personally track because it's unassailable. This is Maine State Lodging and Restaurant Tax information. The state publishes it monthly, and so it's based on receipts. So from this, you can extrapolate what the gross revenues are for hotels and restaurants. And you can see the seasonality in good example right there. One thing you don't see is the last 3 months, and that's because it's a trailing report. I really wish they could get their data faster to us, because right now we don't even have, we have through September. Because one of the things I'm interested in, and I want to put it out on this slide, is the September numbers. If you can look at that, again, it's a little difficult to maybe understand, but I'll try to make it pretty simple as far as the lodging revenue through September in the state of Maine was up 7%, very healthy. That's over a record last year and a record the year before, right? 7%. But note September lodging revenue at minus 0.3. My concern about that is that's indicative of factors that relate to something that Andrea talked about earlier, workforce shortage. Our concern is that hotels are not making all their rooms available because they don't have people to clean them, as an example. And restaurants are not open every day of the week because they don't have chefs available to cook on Sundays or Tuesday nights. Similarly, the restaurant revenue tracked lower as well. 3.3 year to date, and then 1.2 in September. September's a good month normally in the state. Those bear watching, and I wish I had another month to like October to see if that trend continued. We don't have that yet. As far as current trends, the millennials, many of whom are in this room, are entering the travel market pretty aggressively now in terms of business travel and vacation travel. And we see that in the branding of properties, new brands like what just opened in South Portland here. The True Hotel out by the Maine Mall is a brand that's geared toward millennials and people a little bit younger than myself, although I've stayed with them and they're very nice. And not a lot of them, but if you look at the major brands, they have very fragmented totals. Like many of the major brands have 12 or more sub-brands, some of which are here in Portland and across the state of Maine. Obviously, new technology is driving a lot of the way people book, and the tech being made available in hotels is quite a bit different than it was a few years ago, such as free Wi-Fi, which is pretty much an entry-level type thing now than it wasn't a few years ago. There's a increasing movement toward local everything with regard to hotels. Because people that travel, even for business now, want to experience the destination differently than they used to, almost like a vacation, business vacation in a sense. We see that with a lot of conferences. The cities that are getting a lot of that business are cities that have really good local culture, food, entertainment, walkability, and things of that nature. So the labor shortage, I do want to touch on that. I don't know that we're the most acute example of that, but I would say, involved in the sector as I am, it's a real issue for many, many of our property owners, both restaurants and hotels. The federal government under the current Trump administration has made significant cuts in the H-2B and the J-1 foreign worker programs. These are not immigrants. These are temporary foreign workers that come here to work, many of whom have been coming for decades, some of them in some of the properties across the state, and they can't get in because they can't get enough visas to be able to meet the totals that we need. Last year we did not have enough. I heard a lot of very desperate stories from some of our members that just couldn't get their people back. And we're really concerned that we're going to see a similar situation this year. Early signs, some people have gotten their workers. Many are still waiting to hear from the federal government on that. Therefore, we also need to, as I like to say, homegrown our own employees. The workforce development programs, again, alluded to by speakers earlier, are not coordinated the way they need to be. Certainly in our sector, definitely not. And so we need to get our members aligned with colleges, community college system primarily for the type of workers we're looking for, but the university state college system and the state and federal government are lined up with the funds to be able to do the kind of training programs we need. And we also have to elevate the status of the hospitality industry so that parents and guidance counselors will direct kids into programs, because there are careers in this industry. And I think if we talk to most of the general managers and people that are running restaurants and hotels, many of them started down toward the bottom and have worked their way up, because it's one of the few industries where that is available for people, as well as owning your own properties and that sort of thing. So we have housing issues where there are worker issues. So down in the South Coast areas, if you bring in workers, where do they stay? There is no housing. City of Portland, there's no place to stay. So we've got those issues to deal with as well. And we fought a big issue last session on the minimum wage tip credit, which many of you might have heard about. We certainly weren't against increasing the minimum wage generally in our industry, because we're paying above that anyhow. But the tip credit, which was the discounts employees could take to pay servers because they earn their money from tips, that was in the referendum erroneously, and it shouldn't have been, but it was, and we got it overturned in the last session. That was a big win for hospitality in Maine. So this is a topic I could spend half the day talking about, is Airbnb, short-term rentals. It's a very important factor nationally. Airbnb, of course, isn't the only provider. There's many others like HomeAway, VRBO, multiples of them. Airbnb, of course, is the brand name that everybody knows. And the market has exploded over the last few years. Many of you in the room probably have clients, or maybe have your own properties in Airbnb setups. Obviously in Portland it's been pretty noted, but not just in Portland, in other cities around the state like Rockland and Bangor and others, where it's Airbnb properties are taking up local workforce housing and upsetting communities that didn't sign on to have unlicensed hotels in their backyard either. So there are those types of issues. The way that we're focused on it at the Maine Innkeepers Association is that we just, number one, want a level playing field. So we're not sponsoring, we're supporting legislation in the current session, LD 1721, to charge a 9% lodging tax to all short-term rental properties. Ironically, that's not on the books in the state of Maine. So people are not necessarily compelled to pay that, and certainly the state isn't looking at that. They will be, though, because that's liable to pass overwhelmingly in this session. There are other things that we would look at with regard to short-term rentals that, basically there are life safety issues. I joked about, I didn't really joke, but I made the comment about licensed hotel properties. The American Hotel and Lodging Association refers to properties that investors do to buy apartment buildings and turn them into short-term rentals as unlicensed hotels, because these properties do not have to have the same life safety codes that a B&B, let's say, would need. A 4-room, 5-room B&B has to have various types of egress and fire safety and other factors. The unlicensed hotel, i.e. B&B, where the owner doesn't occupy the building, doesn't need that. We're more focused on registering these properties, so at least we know who owns them, and there's a way to audit whether people are paying the taxes and that sort of thing. But I think that this is going to be a local issue you'll see across the state. It won't be a state mandate, I doubt, at least not initially. But there are local communities across the state that are enacting permitting to track who owns the properties, and so if there's an issue, they know who to contact, and et cetera. And also decide where they want the properties located, whether they should be in the middle of residential communities or not. Those are issues that we're not necessarily engaged on in our association, but bears watching over the next few years. Oops. As far as trends going forward, I think it was mentioned earlier, renovations are huge in the hotel business right now, basically refreshing tired properties and updating, particularly areas like meeting space, or at least open space as opposed to the rooms themselves. I think we know that a lot of people like to co-work and share space and can meet people in lobbies and that sort of thing. Many hotels are updating their ability to avail that for people. So there's a main focus on that. I think that's sort of the modern version of what B&Bs have always done, try to engage guests and that sort of thing. But I think we see it in the design now of newer hotels to try to make it more of a residential feel as opposed to a commercial property. As far as some of the markets, I'll just touch on briefly. Portland's market, obviously, as I said earlier, is very strong, but also you can see the growth numbers as well as the occupancy rates and the average daily rate. One of the things about seasonality is that it drives down some of these, sort of broader metrics that you use, so that we don't see necessarily what it might be. I mean, this would be more interesting to look at what the average daily rate is in August versus on an annual basis. It's appreciably higher. But it's driven by the food business primarily, and culture and art and history, and the actual favorable nature of Portland as a destination is driving business travel even. So it's something that we're still on the top 10 list, best of list, as is Maine in general. Something that we need to sustain on the long term, which is going to be a challenge, I think, going forward as cycles adjust and business isn't as strong. We'll see. As far as Augusta, this data is broken out, by the way, by another consulting firm. So they call it Augusta, Maine South. It's everything but Portland and Augusta South. Now, Augusta, where I work, is seeing a little bit of a resurgence in its downtown, I will say. I've been quite impressed since I've been there 18 months working. The downtown, a lot of new restaurants popping up, microcosm of what's happened here in the Old Port area of Portland. So it's actually starting to see some more evidence of that, not only in places like Augusta, but other parts of the state, which I'll speak to in a minute. But certainly the South Coast, very strong. It continues to be strong. As far as Bangor and North, a little less strong in terms of its occupancy rates, roughly flat. Bangor actually has got a lot going for it, though, right now. I mean, that cross center up there has been very successful. It's a big room, similar to this, and it offers a lot of entertainment options as well. Surprisingly, the Hollywood Casino has been a big driver, and that whole area has seen new hotels come up around it. And again, another restaurant scene in a place like Bangor, which sort of needed new restaurants for many years. Having gone to school up there at the University of Maine at Orono, I can speak as a semi-part-time resident for 4 years. The Mid-Coast and Bar Harbor, we don't have the statistics on this, but pockets of the Mid-Coast have had a tough year. Other parts has been extremely strong. The Rockland, Camden area, very strong. Some of the other peninsulas and some of the other areas of the Mid-Coast, not so much. Bar Harbor had another excellent year, or Mount Desert and Ellsworth and the entire area. The Park did extremely well. It continues to be one of the core destinations in the state. It shows up in all the numbers. But Bar Harbor's got interesting problems too, because if you go there right now, it's like a ghost town. And I say no restaurants, hyperbole there. Few restaurants open, many darkened buildings. Many of those are Airbnb bought up homes in downtown Bar Harbor that now don't have people, therefore they're dark. So it creates a difficulty for people like Jackson Labs trying to recruit scientists and knowledge workers to come in there because there isn't the housing, there isn't the vibrancy of the downtown except in the 5 or 6 months in the summer. So it's a cultural factor too. Cruise ship business is strong both in Portland and Bangor, by the way, and Rockland. I don't want to leave Rockland. Rockland, Bangor, and Portland, very strong cruise numbers. I know that Royal Caribbean in particular is big in all 3 ports and Portland gets extremely good reviews from passengers. So they do like the Portland market a lot. And so I think we're going to continue to see the cruise passengers, which really don't leave much in the economy because they're not staying in hotels. They're not, really eating in restaurants, because if you've been on cruises, you don't need to eat on land on a cruise ship, But so they don't buy a lot, but the presumption is they're going to come back because they're going to see what a great place this is and they're going to want to revisit. I don't want to say they don't leave any money behind because they do, but not as much as the beauty of the ships might suggest. So just a few notable transactions that we wanted to note. And so a lot of this comes from Daigle's analysis of the market, some of the work they've done. That Residence Inn in Portland was amazing to me. That thing sold for $311,000 per room. Biggest transaction, I believe, in the state history, in the hospitality industry, $55 million. People don't put that kind of money into a place unless they have a long-term view of this market. So that and something else I'll talk to in just a minute are good positive signs, for at least for Portland. As far as places like Bangor, that's the Holiday Inn in Bangor, long-time property that turned over this year at a fairly good clip as well. And really across the state, look at places like Boothbay Harbor and the other islands around Boothbay area, starting to see activity. Obviously we know that the golf course and some other properties that have been invested by Mr. Paul Coulombe up there has started to jumpstart. The Maine Botanical Gardens is a huge, I think it's like one of the number 1 public park attractions on TripAdvisor. So it's drawing some folks to that market. Again, a snapshot of a few others that you can look at. Transactions going on in Old Orchard and South Coast areas, Wells, York. And then a little further up the coast in Rockland and Bar Harbor, some of the properties that we've seen go under contract this year. Different spots across the state. So activity is strong everywhere, I think, in the hospitality sector itself. There are a few new products that I wanted to note. So I mentioned the True by Hilton downtown, out by the mall, but we've also seen the new Hampton Inn down in Kennebunk, and the Oxford finally got a hotel across from the casino. And then a smaller place right up on the east side over here on Congress Street, the Francis, which also has a restaurant part of it, similar to another place here in Portland called the Danforth. It's somewhat similar. A lot in the pipeline, though. As you can see, we've got examples from across the state going on, including places like Rumford and others. We all know Portland is still seeing a huge growth. At least 5 that I know of properties in the pipeline or in some stage of development. So the outlook, very briefly, for 2018, we're expecting the average daily rate to continue upward, as I said earlier, to try to match the national average this year, roughly a 2 to 3% increase. Same thing with RevPAR itself. I think the new supply will likely keep those occupancy levels flat, but it's not just that. It's really, we got to expand the seasonality in the state, and we're working on it. The State Office of Tourism is trying to drive business outside of the key summer months. So, there's that. Business travel tends to be springs and fall, and so there's an opportunity for us to develop more business travel in this state too. So we don't leave that out of the mix as well. And as we've got the continuing challenges of short-term rentals and hospitality workers that are going to continue to bite at our heels here in 2018 and become potentially a mitigating factor in some of the growth numbers. Hopefully not, but bears close attention. So I want to thank you very much, and I guess that's my presentation. I don't know if we have time for questions. We're kind of rolling through fast. So thank you all very much.